Summoning my contrarian genius, today we are going to defend O.J. Simpson, and we're going to exonerate his name as not being completely guilty of the murder of Nicole Brown and Ron Goldman. In fact, when we're looking at the facts here, we're looking at a guy who is simply innocent beyond the pale, to the point to where people would actually faint if they knew the truth, which I know personally because I'm that good. So, as we all know, there's a famous movie called Devil's Advocate. We're going to embody that Al Pacino spirit, the Faustian spirit. We're going to get right into the facts. When you're doing investigations into a court case, you have to understand what the motives are, who the plaintiffs are, who the defendants are, and just really understand what angle people are coming at this thing with. Right now, we're looking at the Simpson trial, about 28 years removed almost. And we've got a trial that, again, is almost 30 years old. And what are the headlines from CNN? It says, Simpson's death is a reminder of the system failing battered women, attorney Gloria Allred says. So think about that. The liberal spin is to say O.J. Simpson is an evil guy. Okay, so now you know who to root for. Let's go back. Again, lawyers and people in law tend to twist words and try to be very slick with the way they speak. Catch this thing right here. So they have some very important evidence here, or not evidence, but just crucial facts saying the brutal killings of Brown Simpson, his ex-wife, and her friend Ron Goldman. Okay, so friend Ron Goldman, again, Ron Goldman was having an affair with O.J. Simpson's wife, but he's a friend. You see how convenient that is, okay? Because God forbid there's some valid reason to kill your ex-wife if she cheats on you. Now, the reason why they don't mention that is because it would actually lend credence to something somewhat far-fetched like what I just said, given the fact that, of course, she was a whore. But let's see. Laying out a proper case includes giving the circumstances in the proper context to flesh out what actually happened at the time. So in the mid-90s, this was post-Rodney King, and very shortly thereafter, so there was a black anti-white resentment, ostensibly, saying that, you know what, the white people have been too hard on a multitude of blacks, and therefore there ought to be some sort of comeuppance. And when you look at interviews, not posthumously, but you know what I mean, like 20 years down the line, we asked the jury, you black people in LA, let's say, okay, how come you guys wanted to acquit OJ? A lot of them don't say, well, it was because he wasn't guilty. It was because of the Rodney King, and it was a revenge vote, which is interesting. But it's also to say that maybe people that are anti-OJ have a tainted point of view. But realistically, even though there's a civil rights kind of cop out for OJ getting acquitted, he still should have been, regardless of the fact. There's a couple of reasons why. So first and foremost, we're going to look at the evidence that is anti-OJ, which there's a lot of. But what we don't have is conclusive evidence, hence why he got away with what he did. Now, what I posit, this is my theory, I think that he walked in on his son killing both Goldman and Brown, and basically said, well, you know what, fuck this bitch, one, and two, that's my son, so I'm going to cover for him. So like a reverse Jesus Christ, he took the blame for his son's sins, even though he partook a little bit, hence why he's a reverse Jesus, and he got away with it, reverse Jesus. Jesus died on the cross. Anyway, and when we're looking at the situation, though, there is a reason to think that this common narrative is false. First of all, how many common narratives today by the media pushed by the left wing are just completely holistically false? What that tends to tell you as a reactionary or somebody who is saying, like, you know what, there's so much fake news now, you got to kind of doubt what's going on here. Now, mind you, let's look at the characters that are involved in this story. We've got O.J. Simpson, of course. We have Johnny Cochran, who's one of the best black lawyers ever. Lee Bailey, who I don't know about, and Alan Dershowitz was this Jewish guy who is one of the best Machiavellian, sort of like devil's advocate. Like, I wish I could learn under him, because the guy is straight up just like pragmatic, amoral. And that's an impressive thing when you're trying to be a lawyer like me. And so what becomes all the more clear is that using a very, very, very legalistic frame of view, OJ is innocent on the technicalities, but even looking at the morality of it, he did not take the life of either of those people, from what I can tell. There is some circumstantial evidence to point to what I was saying. Chief among them being that, for example, when you're looking at OJ's gloves, they did not fit. Now, there's a cope about that after, saying like, oh, well, actually, he, like they shrunk during testing, which is retarded, because how much could they possibly shrink? And these lawyers, the prosecution, which are in a very high-end case, how come that just never crossed to them? Like, hey, maybe the glove shrank. Now, what is interesting, though, is that he does have a son, and that son so happens to be. All right, so looking further into this whole glove thing, so the famous line from Johnny Cochran is that if the glove don't fit, you must acquit, which is something my dad says all the time. And it's an important crux to a legal argument, because you're really saying that OJ single-handedly killed two people, when in reality it was two that were participating in the event. And what's also crazy is that we have OJ clearly being 6'1". He has a son in Jason here that I think killed the two of them, and he's like maybe 5'10". And so, interesting that the glove was somewhat small on OJ, but you have a son that is smaller than OJ. you wouldn't think the glove would have fit him. But here comes the problem with the entire case to begin with. The case into Nicole Simpson's death had virtually nothing to do with the son. The son wasn't scrutinized, which is interesting because the son wasn't really a suspect in the case, despite the fact that he was not a suspect at the time. OJ felt it necessary to spend a lot of money on a lawyer. So why get a defense attorney for a kid who is not even guilty at all, according to the common narrative? One. And two, how come if he's not guilty and you know yourself that you killed Nicole, why the fuck would you get a lawyer for a guy who you know is not guilty because you know yourself killed those two by yourself? It doesn't make sense, folks. Well, it only makes sense if you knew that Jason was involved in it and had a big stake in the killings of these two. Therefore, he got a defense attorney. That was expensive, don't you think? So we have a couple of things already stacked up. And mind you, I've looked into this thing for like 20 minutes. And what I've already found is that the gloves that whole crux is really reasonably explained by Jason being the one with the gloves. Now, here's another detail. At the crime scene, thereabouts, there was a hat with animal, like obviously non-human hair, which Jason had a dog, and hair that did not match OJ. Now, this was just not really included in the evidence, which is interesting, you know? So it's kind of odd. So you have a famous running back, one of the best ever, okay? The first running back in NFL history when there was less games in regulation, by the way. In the regular season, he had over 2,000 yards, about 6.0 yards per carry. Just phenomenal. You would love him in fantasy if he were still around. But I will tell you this. So he's a famous guy, the Juice they called him, and the son really didn't have any clout. So how convenient that the government, and what I mean by the government, I mean like the state of California, that legal system, hammered in on OJ, but not the son. But then they give you the moral indignation of, oh my God, these two people died. First of all, did anybody know who the fuck OJ's wife was before OJ married her? Answer is nobody. What about the boy toy? Neither. So, I mean, this argument is really an emotional one where they're trying to make a TMZ tabloid out of this murder, but they're going to grandstand against the people that are pro OJ, which I am pro OJ. Okay. I think he's funny. He had a MAGA hat on his mantle years ago. I think that's fucking awesome. But what's also key about this guy is that there are lawyers that are, again, killers. They are killers insofar as they're so competent. They're killers because they can really hammer in on details. And this is what you call the higher stratum of autism, which I would say I'm a part of, where you can hammer in on things and absent the morality. There is a legal structure to this that has to be respected. There are some contradictions already in the common narrative as we know it today in the O.J. Simpson case. Chief among them being, again, the gloves. Already, I have plausible explanations for a ton of holes in the prosecution's theory of the murder. Okay, one thing, the glove doesn't fit a 6'1" OJ, but it would probably fit a 5'10" Jason. Okay, there's a hat on the scene that wasn't OJ's. Who was it then? Okay, that hat. There's pictures of Jason with that same hat. Isn't that a coincidence? Isn't that funny? Okay, so that's another thing. So that's two. Three, when we look at it, Jason was a chef at the time, and he had knife training from when he was in the military. Okay, so very convenient that those two were killed with a knife, and that the son knew how to kill people with a knife, and OJ obviously wouldn't really know. He'd have to be guessing, which I guess couldn't be too freaking hard. But I mean, the point is that he already had experience. Now, what's interesting about this is that there's some things that make OJ look guilty. Robert Kardashian was rumored to have moved a knife from the crime scene, so to speak, in a way to kind of make OJ look innocent. But in reality, what if they were covering for OJ's son? Maybe it was OJ's son's knife, in fact, that they were covering for. And since OJ was the only suspect, it made him look bad. So you can see how this whole thing is a litany of miscommunications and a press that doesn't care about prosecuting the son because there's no content in some no-name son of a running back being the killer of some housewife and a Jewish guy who worked at a bar or something, Ron Goldman. So, I mean, just looking at it for that, you have to really look at the facts. And let's go through one quote I want to give you here. Robert Shapiro, which again was part of this dream team. Think about Jordan Allen Iverson, all these greats, but think about it in a lawyer term. You have Cochran, Kardashian, Shapiro, and you've got this dream team. Now, he says in an interview that there's legal justice that was done, but a moral justice that was not, okay? So there's a moral justice that he couldn't even discuss with his wife. This is Robert Shapiro speaking, okay? Now, he feels that OJ was not the murderer, and a moral justice was him not being able to tell the truth, which was that, honestly, Jason did it. So there is, and again, Okay, so lawyers are so entrenched in playing devil's advocate, trying to get people lower sentences, even though they know their guy is guilty. They have to argue from a point of view that is absent that morality, absent that truth, because that is not what the legal system is here to do. When you're looking at it that way, it's very clear how you could see a guy who is, let's say, 50, 60 years old, has decades in the system, making millions of dollars defending people that are guilty, celebrities, and saying, you know what, I'm going to defend OJ on the merits that he didn't kill Nicole, knowing full well that probably his son did it. And even OJ could have kept that a secret from the lawyers, and that could be very true. We don't know. And it could have been an open secret, like, okay, I mean, clearly it had to be your kid. But look at it that way. Now, let's look at the relationship between OJ, the stepmother, which is again Nicole Brown. That's a white chick. Obviously, the son came out black, so it can't be that. It's not the mom. But anyway, so he has anger issues. Jason does. Okay, he was a chef. And his alibi was that he was at work during the time of the murder. Now, what's very convenient is that the murder happened after 10 o'clock, but after 9:50, I believe, was the last time that Jason was spotted by anybody in the public. In fact, he was working there, but his only evidence that he was working there after a certain point was that he had a timesheet that he wrote himself. It was handwritten, even though there was an electronic way of doing it. And this was 1995. It wasn't like, oh, I clocked it in 1935 and I had to write it down and you had to take my word for it. You know, Scott's honor pledge. That's not it. That's not the Eagle Scout pledge. You don't need that. Now there's a Scantron, there's shit like that. And when you're looking at a time clock, that's been around for over 30 years. So when we're looking at it, how come you have a timesheet that is only written down, but you didn't take the electronic records despite them working at the time? Again, another piece of circumstantial evidence, which lends to the fact that Jason did kill Nicole and the Goldman. Now, what's interesting about this, by the way, is that a civil jury, when you talk about people about the O.J. Simpson case and you tell them righteously, as I do all the time, I'll say, hey, O.J. was innocent. Free my man. Okay, they'll be like, well, he was found, I think in 2007, of, even though he was not guilty in a criminal case, in a civil jury, they found him to be liable, upwards of $33 million. Okay, well, you know what? That burden of proof is very different. Very different. So again, in a civil jury, I think I could get Jason culpable too, just based off of all the circumstantial evidence. And a lot of this evidence is not even stuff I've sourced myself, but just looking at the holes in the story between the OJ one, you can just tell, you can read between the lines. So it's like a Fibonacci sequence of cope, really, looking at it. Now, let's move on to the next fact. So as we all know, the O.J. Simpson case was one of the first major examples of DNA being used in a suit. Now, this homicide was really important because this DNA was really tricky to procure because, first of all, the accuracy is in question because, again, this is very early on. Now, the second thing you want to talk about today is going to be that, of course, if OJ's blood matches with a certain sample, well, wouldn't his son's blood also correlate heavily with that? Now, did Jason's blood get tested at all? That's another question, okay? So wouldn't that be due diligence? Wouldn't you want to volunteer your blood? If Jason were really just very open to doing this, why not donate your own blood and get yourself off that so you can save your dad millions of dollars on having a fucking huge defense attorney on retainer? My question. Now, that's a rhetorical one because I know damn well that had Jason's blood been tested, it would have been very obvious who was guilty of these murders along with OJ. So, as I already mentioned, we have that Navy knit cap that was found in that crime scene. And that murder site housed that Jason hat. Now, here's another detail. Again, the devil's in the details, and I'm the devil's advocate today. So, knives that were used in the murder of these two were matching with the knives found in Jason's storage room. Okay, so there had been some forays into looking into the culpability of Jason as they interacted with each other. And what do you know? These knives used to kill that couple actually match the ones that he had in his storage room. And he was a chef, so obviously you have knives when you're doing that. And he had knife training in the military, where OJ had knives that did not match at all in his own possession. Very convenient, okay? So you think OJ went into his son's shit, took his knives, and then killed them with those same type of knives, and then just to point the evidence towards his son? Obviously not true. Now, let's look at another piece of circumstantial evidence. And again, I'm veering a little bit away from the court logic because clearly you could say, it's inadmissible. Oh, you're looking too much into the history of the client. Okay, listen, this is just me being awesome, okay? So if you look into the criminal history of Jason Simpson, you'll notice right away that the guy was convicted or charged with domestic violence, using a knife against his girlfriend, almost killing her, and he had mental disorders on the books already. Now, at the time of the murder, he was already on probation for assaulting one of his bosses with a fucking knife. So just keep that in mind, okay? So he's known for having a tumultuous relationship with Nicole Simpson, okay? She's caught with a lover. So think about it. You have a hot stepmom in Nicole Simpson. You're this frustrated guy who assaults women with knives, gets mad at your boss, threatens him with a knife. So again, you have a motive of hurting Nicole because she's having this affair with Ron Goldman, and I mean, it's a perverted thing, but she's not blood, so I guess he might have been into her. I don't know. That's his dad's girl, but I mean, boy's got to. He was desperate. I don't know. But listen, he's got a domestic violence history. So that's, I mean, so this whole, like, again, because this is just getting at the root of the OJ Simpson hate bandwagon, okay? They're going to be like, oh my God, OJ beat Nicole and he gave her a black eye. And while that could be true, how many guys beat their wives and don't actually kill them? The vast majority. So just because he beat his wife doesn't mean he killed her. It hardly even correlates, in my opinion, okay? But again, I haven't looked into that. Now, moreover, the son has been guilty of the same shit to other women that aren't Nicole. So, I mean, that just is a wash. But even looking at it better, when you're looking and scrutinizing the facts, we're reading it right here, folks. We're seeing that he has charges for related things to the Nicole thing, such as using knives against people that are close to him, that draw emotions. He's got mental disorders. He's got a motive. Okay. Now, investigators found blood and skin under Nicole's fingernails, which did not match O.J. Simpson's blood or Ron Goldman's. And Ron's knuckles were bruised trying to fight off a murderer, presumably. But O.J. voluntarily stripped at the LAPD when he was questioned, and there were no marks on his knuckles. Think about that. Jason wrote in his diary that it was a year of knife and he would have solved the problems with the knife. Hmm. Interesting. Interesting. So there's a lot of like very, very convoluted writings in his diary that I'm looking into right now, which kind of shows he's mentally ill, which kind of shows that if his stepmom pissed him off and had an affair with the guy, that he was likely to kill them. It also shows that if he were to kill them, he'd probably use a knife, given the fact that he had knife training and that he used knives against other people in the past. It shows in the records that he had a criminal propensity of threatening people with a fucking knife. It shows that he had the capacity to do so, the motive. There's circumstantial evidence to point to it. And in fact, when there's blood under the fingernails of Nicole Simpson that are not OJ's or Ron's, who the fuck else's could it be other than the son? But whose blood was not sampled in the trial? It was the son's DNA that was not in the court. Well, isn't that the big issue, huh? Maybe it wasn't in the court because it would have blown everything up, huh? And that mean also, again, if I knew my son without a shadow of a doubt was innocent of murdering Nicole and I knew I did it, then I would have that defense attorney not on retainer for my kid if I were OJ. Because what happened to OJ? He ended up broke. In fact, he had to steal his own memorabilia from the NFL because he was so broke. He had to do it in Vegas like in 2008. Why? Because he couldn't pay for the civil litigation that was imposed upon him in 2007. And because he had to have a huge roster in this dream team that was super expensive. So to say that like he hired some defense attorney knowing that he didn't have the money to afford that long term proves that it doesn't make sense when somebody with that notion posits it. So these anti-OJ people need to shut the fuck up. So as I'm looking into this, and again, this is something that I was really just like blessed to have just thought of right now. But basically, when you're looking at the time card history, I'm looking into it. So Jason has no witnesses, of course, saying that he stayed past 9:30 around the time that the murder happened. But what is interesting about the circumstance is that this was the only time that he had a handwritten time card for the murder, for his work. Isn't that crazy? So you use electronic time schedules every single fucking day for God knows how long. And then the one day where there's a murder, you handwrite it. Isn't that interesting? In fact, it kind of reminds me of the movie Gone Girl, where I think she gets a movie that's going to happen, let's say, between 5 and 7. She commits a murder between 5 and 7, and then comes back at the end of the movie and is like, well, bro, look at the ticket stub. I was busy these 2 hours, but there's no proof of it. You just had to show up like 10 minutes before the movie, buy the ticket, put it in your fucking pocket, and then come back and be like, well, I was here the whole time. But there's no witnesses to say you were. And sure, you could have plausible deniability, like, well, it was empty, or, there's like 200 people in the movie. Nobody saw me. All add up. So let's look into some rebuttal points. So again, I played devil's advocate. Now the angel on the shoulder is telling me certain things. Looking into serology test, PCR blood test, there is a notion in the mid 90s, in the infancy of DNA, that there was a wet degradation of blood that was pooling. Okay, so when you have Nicole's blood in a pool, and you have it, so consolidated to a point to where the efficiency of a testing protocol becomes more convoluted in that pocket of time 30 years ago, it becomes a question as to maybe if it wasn't pointing to OJ, is it really Jason's, or was it really OJ's? It's a very difficult thing to know, because you could have a test that says one thing and then another one that says the other. Also, the admissibility in court, given the low degree of confidence and the degradation of the DNA sample itself, there's a lot of things you could say, like, oh, let's throw that away. So, in a similar notion to how the O.J. Simpson defense attorneys, in bad faith, said, "Oh, fuck it, there's some like misconceptions there. Okay, O.J.'s completely innocent." We could also say the same thing about Jason. Like, there are some holes in my argument too. So we're gonna look into these right now. Here's an interesting little factoid. Okay, when we're looking at the sort of medications that Jason Simpson was on at the time, let's look at the facts. Okay, he was not taking his Depakote meds, which are used to prevent migraine headaches, but it's also used to treat acute manic or mixed episodes associated with bipolar disorder, or with or without psychotic features. Okay, so look at that. So, checking the facts, this guy was not taking his meds, which are supposed to stop manic or mixed episodes. Well, what happens in a manic episode for a guy who's been known for domestic violence, knife assault, and shit like this? Well, likely if he's in a certain berserker mode and he's not on his anger issue meds, then he's more likely to kill his evil stepmom, which stood him up for a dinner because she was with her fucking affair guy. Isn't that interesting? And come on. Sorry. So to wrap up the video, let's look at a plausible theory that I have lined up as to what actually happened in 1995. So the theory goes like this, okay? So Jason Simpson, enraged that his mother, or so his stepmom Nicole, didn't go to dinner with him, basically went to her home to confront her about it and bitch, okay? He realizes what was happening with Ron Goldman, again, that she was shacking up with him despite being married to a Hall of Fame running back, okay? So imagine how pissed off you must be. And again, this is not your baby mama. This is not your girlfriend. But just imagine if your dad remarried and his wife was fucking cheating on him and you walked in on that. You might be pissed. And when you're off of your anger issue meds, it gets more aggravated when you're in an episode. And she already shit on you when you're a chef and she doesn't want to go to your thing. Now that gets even more emasculating. Now, mind you this. There is facts that, for example, there was two siblings in the house asleep. Okay, so his stepsister and his brother, I think, were sleeping in the house at the time. And so you would think, would OJ go up to those kids, knowing that they were in the house, kill those two, knowing that, and that it was premeditated because there was an affair? Answer is no. In fact, when we're looking at who was more likely to like manic outburst or to do domestic violence, although OJ had those problems, he was not literally bipolar. He was not literally on anger issue meds that he was forsaking for the sake of this murder. So clearly, Jason is more likely to have done something here. Anyway, so he rages out knowing that his brother and sister are in the house. He doesn't care. He rages out and he tries to kill those two people. So back then, the cell phone records weren't really something that were impugned at the time. So it is completely plausible for a guy who was not a suspect in Jason to call up his dad after killing these two and then letting him know that, in fact, these people died and that he needs help covering that shit up. So OJ shows up to the house, sees what Jason did. He could have split his hands open because, again, so here's part of the reason why OJ got primary suspect, the honors of it, okay? The reason why was because he had cuts on his hands, which he couldn't account for. And so he said that he had like broken his hand on like a glass table or something in a hotel room in Chicago, I believe, which obviously doesn't really make sense. What makes more sense is that he like broke his hand on glass, after seeing that his son just fucking killed people and he was seething about it, which makes sense. Obviously, like, son, what'd you do? Which, checks out. Now, what he didn't have is marks of Ron Goldman fighting him, which is something that was obvious, that Ron Goldman had marks on his hand, evidence of fighting somebody, obviously when you're bare knuckling it. And OJ Simpson had none of those issues, which is interesting. So the only evidence that he had actually like killed people per se is that he had cuts on his hand. But what are these cuts from? What could have cut your hand when you're fighting somebody barehanded? It doesn't make sense. And even if it's your own knife, it would have reflected in a certain way that would have actually made it obvious that there were cut marks by a knife. But as we know, those knives matched the ones that had the son. The son had it in his storage room. It wasn't stuff that OJ had on his own person, which makes a lot of sense. Okay. Now, did they check Jason after the murder? Wouldn't it have been obvious? Like, hey, what the fuck? Your son has mental issues. She has a reason to hate your wife. Let's look into this. Let's interview your son. They never did that. The LAPD fucked up. They fumbled. Okay. Two, when we're looking at this circumstance, let's really impugn the circumstance. This Jason fellow, had they just checked him, probably would have seen all sorts of marks on the guy's body. But instead, they didn't do that. Did they test his blood? They didn't do that either. So that's an L on the government. Now, let's keep looking. So OJ gets there again, maybe like breaks a vase and like cuts his hand. He orders Jason to go home and clean up and get rid of the clothes, and he would have had to have gone home as well and pretend like nothing happened. Okay, so again, trying to get his son out the scene, so he has to clean it himself. Hence why his blood was there, because he was interacting with those bodies, and he wasn't ready to. Like, he didn't have like biodegradable gloves and this whole shit, like Dexter. So that night, he also called up a lawyer for Jason. Okay, so that next day, Jason already had a lawyer. Okay, and when you look at this, no one else but Jason had a lawyer. Okay, so not even OJ had a lawyer specifically for this. Had he won on retainer, maybe, but he specifically went out to get Jason a lawyer, not anybody else. Interesting. And when the police tried to question him, they were rebuffed. Okay, but they didn't even try hard to begin with. Okay, Christopher Darden wanted to go after him, but was rebuffed. The focus was only on OJ. So they tried a little bit. Obviously, like, it's a routine thing. Clearly, like, let's just ask anybody who's been around here recently what happened. But they just said no, which is interesting, because OJ was willing to be interviewed for over 3.5 hours right after the murder, but Jason wasn't, which is interesting, because if Jason were so innocent, why the fuck would he not speak? Because why? Let's say he didn't do it. Maybe it's bad optics because the guy's insane. But if he's insane, who fucking cares? It doesn't factor into this case. It doesn't. Anyway, looking at this more, Jason got away with murder and OJ Simpson got away with messing with the crime scene, which is basically an accessory to murder, which is not a capital punishment and is not a 25 to life sort of problem. So look at that. Now, the knit cap that OJ supposedly wore had dog hairs, and obviously that didn't fit in. So let's look at more evidence. So in this episode of Devil's Advocate, we really got to the bottom of it. I personally believe, gun to my head, and this is a very big armor piercing round. I mean, that could be completely destroyed here if I got it wrong. But under the pressure of complete scrutiny, I personally think that OJ Simpson is innocent more or less of what people say. Now, to be fair, I think he was an accessory to murder. He basically swept it up for his son, which you can basically begrudgingly respect that and say, like, you know what, that's like, it's family business. Your son kills your wife. Oh, it's tough. Maybe you shouldn't have cheated on me, Nicole. It's tough. I guess. I mean, look, he covered up for his kid. And would I do the same? Answer is maybe. So, I mean, I don't really hate OJ. And the fact is that people are calling him a murderer. And they're saying it so, like, just so indignantly. And those people need to be fucking humbled, folks. It is insane what is going on in the society. So we have a suicide squad of, Deshaun Watson. We have fucking Michael Jackson. We've got other innocent, somewhat fucked up people like, again, OJ Simpson. And so we're building a roster. And what we're looking at here is a guy who, clearly had his son with horrible issues off his meds with motive to kill his stepmama, and the guy who happened to be there too, having an affair. Well, isn't that crazy? And we'll see y'all in the next video. Adios.